There are a few things that bother me more than apologists using false arguments to justify their false beliefs. So I came up with a list of 3 false arguments that believers rely on to uphold their faith. If you're a believer, then listen close. If you're not, then I'm sure you've heard these arguments before. Let's call out these false arguments whenever we hear them. Let's start off with one of the most famous arguments used by Mormons. Have you ever had a debate with a Mormon that inevitably drifted into comparing lifestyles of believers and non-believers? I don't know, maybe something like this? Yep, that's right. The first false argument is, by their fruits ye shall know them.
Joseph Smith declared that his work was the Lord's work. His credentials as a prophet of God are not adequately tested by historical relics. The fruits of the restored gospel of Jesus Christ are the real test of Joseph and his work.
This kind of thinking was the basis for my testimony. I would say things like, I have a testimony of the Young Men's Program because of the way it has personally helped my life. Or I have a testimony of the Word of Wisdom because I see the benefits in my health. But as I got older, I realized that this is not a valid epistemology. And to explain why, let me give a little analogy. What if I told you that Zeus was sitting on Mount Olympus and demanded that you stop eating unhealthy food because he wanted all the delicious food for himself? He promised that if you did this, he would bless you with long life, happiness, and health. Congrats, you listened to this commandment, and here you are with a long life, happiness, and health. Praise Zeus, right? I'd like to bear my testimony that I know Zeus to be true. Obviously, you can see the issues here. We don't have enough evidence to prove that Zeus is actually the cause of this long life, happiness, and health. This mistake is called a false cause fallacy. Perhaps the real reason you have these benefits is because eating healthy food is good for the body's function and allows you to live without sickness. Just as with Zeus, the outcomes of our actions are not valid points when considering truth claims like, did Joseph Smith speak to God? Did Jesus rise from the dead? Does God exist at all? No matter how good or bad your life is by living in accordance with Mormon teachings, it does not tell you if the Book of Mormon is literally true. If that's not enough, there's another major issue with this line of thinking, and it's another logical fallacy. It's called the genetic fallacy. This fallacy is when information is determined to be good, bad, true, or false based on the person presenting it. If you don't like the person, then you don't like what the person says. This is exactly what happens when by their fruits is used as a justification. A person's success or failure in life has no bearing on the validity of the information being presented. You can be a successful person and still be full of shit. And you can be a failure but be full of good information.
Stronger swordsman does not necessarily win. It is speed. Speed of hand. Speed of mind.
Knowing information is completely different than acting on information. And lastly, the stupid metaphor makes no sense. A perfectly good tree can have bad fruit. Sometimes the fruit is infected with bugs. Sometimes there's a late frost that prevents the trees from having a good harvest. The fruit is not a good indication of the worthiness of the tree. If you chop down every tree that had some bad fruit, then we'd likely never have fruit at all. And when you look at the analogy in this light, maybe it's a better analogy than I thought. The by their fruits argument is just what someone says when they want to avoid addressing truth claims and would rather divert the conversation to a more comfortable topic. It's a super common tactic, especially in Mormonism.
And it says here in verse 16, ye shall know them by their fruits. Do men gather grapes of thorns or figs of thistles? In other words, that's how you know if something is true or not, more than anything else, I think, is you hash it out. You take a look at what are the results. You can listen to someone and they can be very flowery. They can be very convincing with something. But what are the results of this? What are the fruits that have happened from this? That's how I think you ought to look at things.
The next false argument I want to discuss stems directly from by their fruits. How should we handle this interesting Zeus metaphor I discussed earlier? Although it's not literally true that Zeus gave us good health, we have good health nonetheless. Jordan Peterson is famous for this type of metaphorical thinking, and I'll call this type of argument the metaphorical truth argument. It's a very simple idea. There are metaphors that can convey some lessons that, if followed, produce desired results, even if the story itself is completely false.
The argument you got into with Sam Harris about the nature of truth. And since I heard that, I've been sort of itching to have this conversation with you, because I think there's a way of viewing this that will actually perhaps reconcile the 2 points of view, but there's a bitter pill that comes along with it. So here's my argument. We tend to think of intellect as having evolved because knowing what's true gives you an advantage. But there's actually nothing that says that the literal truth is where advantage lies. And so I have a category that I call literally false, metaphorically true. These are ideas that aren't true in the factual sense, but they are true enough that if you behave as if they were true, you come out ahead of where you would be if you behaved according to the fact that they're not true. So let me give you a couple of trivial examples that won't be controversial. Porcupines can throw their quills. It's not true. However, if you live near porcupines and you imagine that porcupines can throw their quills, you'll give them some space. If you don't, you may, realizing that they can't throw their quills, get really close to one, and it may wheel around and nail you with a porcupine quill, which can be extremely dangerous because they are microscopically designed to move in from where they puncture you over time, and they can puncture a vital organ, or you can get an infection. So the person who believes that a porcupine can throw their quills has an advantage that isn't predicated on the fact that this is actually a literal truth.
This porcupine analogy has a very simple explanation. What's true is that if you are cautious around porcupines, you'll be safer. But it's false to say that porcupines can throw their quills. This concept of metaphorical truth has been overcomplicated in order to Jesus smuggle.
You will listen to their argument a whole long part of the way. And there's somewhere at the end of it, you know you're going to be worried about it. And he came up with this phrase, I love this phrase. He says, Jesus smuggling.
Right, yeah.
Jesus smuggling is, you're going to follow all the way, yes, and then the worry is that when you get to the bit that you're not so good on, that's when they're going to smuggle in Jesus.
Yeah.
My suspicion is that you have a reservation about some of what Jordan is saying on substructures, on stories, and much more, because you're worried that at some point, either on this stage or off it, at some point when you're not looking,
No, yes, or when I am looking.
He's going to Jesus smuggle you.
This is not complicated, but people like Jordan Peterson use this type of misunderstanding to push their metaphors as truth. It's this type of confusion that allows Jordan Peterson to say that the Bible is true. He'll even say things like, it's more true than true.
Religious people make the claim, people of the Bible make the claim, the Bible is true. The Bible is true in a very strange way. It's true in that it provides the basis for truth itself. And so it's like a meta-truth. Without it, there couldn't even be the possibility of truth. And so maybe that's the most true thing. The most true thing isn't some truth per se, it's that which provides the precondition for all judgments of truth.
Now, I'm not saying that using the Bible as a metaphor is off limits or stupid. But when Jordan Peterson deliberately does this in order to blur the lines between literal truth and metaphorical truth, that's when we have a problem. Hell, he can't even answer a question like, do you believe in God?
Do you believe in God? And I think, okay, there's a couple of mysteries in that question. What do you mean do? What do you mean you? What do you mean believe? And what do you mean God?
As Jordan Peterson has risen to prominence, it's become common for people to use his metaphorical truth to push their religious beliefs. Rather than actually trying to justify Moses parting the Red Sea, or even the story of the Book of Mormon, believers will make the claim that these stories are more true than true. Wrong. They're false stories that teach principles that can be beneficial. It's not complicated. This is just ridiculous religious sophistry, used to avoid confronting the dissonance of holding obviously unscientific false beliefs in the 21st century.
So I'll just say briefly to it that I think we run into very serious problems of interpretation and that flood into the rest of the biblical narrative when we say that it's a poetic narrative and it's not literal creation story. He's speaking about the creation account, and that's a literal account for him. If we say that the creation narrative in Genesis 1 and 2 is poetic and it's not truly literal, then is that true also for Genesis 3? Is it true about the fall? Is it true about our first parents? And if so, if we say, well, that's also up for grabs, maybe it's not our literal Adam and Eve.
The last and final false argument is that free will and consciousness obviously show that we have a soul. They'll say things like, if we're just atoms in motion, how can we have consciousness?
There's no such thing as morality if you're just a bunch of chemicals.
To counter this misconception, we need to discuss the concept of emergence. Emergence will take away the most aggressive arguments that religious people have. Arguments like, how do humans develop without a designer? Or how do we have morals if we're just animals?
To do with the ontological category known as morality. Where does morality come from? Does it come from the benzene molecule, the carbon molecule, the oxygen molecule? In your worldview, where does it come from?
The concept of emergence opens the door for potential explanations to these complex issues. Just as an overview, emergence is the concept that from small, simple parts added together, more complex systems emerge that have properties not exhibited by the simple parts.
How can a bunch of stupid things do smart things together? This phenomenon is called emergence, and it's one of the most fascinating and mysterious features of our universe. In a nutshell, it describes small things forming bigger things that have different properties than the sum of their parts. Emergence is complexity arising from simplicity. And emergence is everywhere. Take wet fabric. If you zoom in far enough, there is no wetness, there are just molecules sitting in the spaces between the atoms of the cloth. Wetness is an emerging property of water, something new only created by a lot of individual interactions between water molecules. And this is sort of it. Many things interact under a certain set of rules, creating something above and beyond themselves. It turns out that more is different. This different property is itself a new thing, and that new thing can couple with other new things to repeat the process. Atoms form molecules, molecules form proteins, proteins make up cells, cells make up organs, organs form individuals, individuals form societies.
Now, I'm not saying that I know this is the case. I am saying that there's plenty of evidence that from small, simple building blocks can emerge beautiful complexity. This is an amazing concept that theists like to forget.
If you were in the woods and you stumbled upon a watch, what would you think?
Well, I'd wonder how it got there.
Would you think it came together by accident?
No way. It's way too complex. There are too many moving pieces and parts that all fit together perfectly.
And this brings us comfortably to yet another major problem with the watchmaker argument. It completely ignores evolution by natural selection. Without getting into it too deeply, natural selection has been completely and utterly proven to be an unconscious process that has given rise to countless complex and purposed organisms, which, without an understanding of natural selection, do indeed give the impression that they were deliberately designed. Or in other words, we know for a fact that nature can, does, and has produced remarkably complex organisms without a conscious and intelligent hand behind it.
It's visible in our everyday lives. You're probably watching this on a computer. A computer fundamentally works by using transistors to store and release electrical charge. From this simple concept emerges the amazing capabilities of your computer. Again, theists pretend they don't understand this concept when it comes to evolution and moral systems, but easily understand it when it comes to computers, cars, horses, and every other complex thing we see in the world. Shocking. Emergence is the underlying principle that allows the world to have complexity. Without it, the world would only consist of atoms doing what atoms do.
And this is what we call the phenomenon of emergence, the idea that there's more than one way of talking about how the universe works. There's a way that might be the most fundamental. Maybe that has to do with atoms and particles and quantum mechanics. But then there's higher level ways, emergent levels in the macroscopic reality that we perceive every day that still tell us something true and useful about the world, even though our information about it is radically incomplete.
With this principle in mind, It opens an avenue for how complex life can emerge from simple structures. It opens the door to how we could have developed complex moral systems. It opens the door for how we could develop a sensation that feels like free will. I'm not saying I know how these complexities develop, but rather I'm saying that it's common in our existence to see simple process develop into complex systems. And perhaps this is how life, morality, and free will emerged. These three false arguments are important to understand. If you understand them, you'll be much less likely to fall prey to religious sophistry and manipulation. No matter where you are with your belief, more accurate thinking will help us get a little bit closer to the truth.